Okay, well, hi everyone, good evening. I guess really this is going to be quite an eclectic presentation compared to some of the others, but I think this evening and GeoMob in general is all about hearing different sorts of presentations. And what I want to talk about is basically what I did during lockdown, which was read quite a lot. I read quite a lot of history and think about stuff, but more than anything else, just wish I was out and about and traveling and visiting places. And also what I want to do for the next few minutes is to take us all on a tour. We'll all go visiting places, and in visiting them tells us a little bit about the history, about the development of the geospatial industry, and in particular, the part of the geospatial industry that's to do with aerial photography, capturing data from mostly aircraft, but it's basically the same principle for satellite imagery. But I want to start off with a point of philosophy. This is a picture of some famous German physicists, Hermann Minkowski. Minkowski was a colleague of Albert Einstein, and he developed the idea of space-time. And space-time is something that we as geographers kind of tend to ignore because, hey, it's complicated and it's about physics. But actually, if we think about it, it's quite fundamental to what we do. Minkowski talked about extending the traditional sort of 3D view of Euclidean space and turning it into 4 dimensions by adding time, called it a 4-dimensional manifold. In effect, what he's saying is if we think about a place, that place can only really be talked about at a specific time. And likewise, a particular time is associated with a particular location. That's what special relativity is all about. And when I think in terms of what we do in geospatial terms, we often miss or we just ignore that the historical element to the content, to the maps that we're looking at. So I thought it would be an interesting way to tell a historic story by looking at the locations that are perhaps important in telling that story. So what's the story I want to talk to you about this evening? Well, it's about aerial photography. Aerial photography really started in the Great War, 1914 to 18, where handheld cameras like this, which would have had a big glass plate in the back of the camera on which you exposed an image, were used for basic intelligence, for capturing what the enemy was doing across the lines. And both Britain, France, Germany, United States, their air forces were originally developed for the sole purpose of capturing photography from aerial photographs. So only later on, to defend the aircraft taking pictures, that fighter planes and bombers and everything else was developed. So, in many ways, the air forces of the world started by that initial task of carrying out aerial photography. Come the end of the Great War in 1918, pretty much across the board, the air forces of the world forgot how to do aerial photography. It wasn't something that was important to them. It certainly wasn't glamorous compared to, high-speed fighters or bombers or whatever else. And a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise was lost. Not completely. A lot of that knowledge and expertise moved off to the commercial sector, to private companies for surveying purposes, for mining and so on. But as far as the military were concerned, it wasn't important anymore. It was something that they could ignore. Okay, so let's go and visit somewhere. Here's my first destination for you. This is probably a surprise. Heston Services. Who'd have thought that this would be my first destination on the trip? And as quite rightly pointed out by, I think, Nessa in the great comedy show, only a fool would stop at Heston. Why am I talking about Heston Services? Well, Heston Services, between the wars, was the location of London's second airport. It's very close to Heathrow Airport now, but from about the mid-1920s, it was the location of London's second airport. And if we zoom out and look at the area from above, at the top of the screen there, you'll see the M4 motorway. We just saw the sign from there. And if I pull up this map here of the Heston Aerodrome, Heston as an aerodrome, aerodromes in the 1920s were not like airports of today. There were no concrete or tarmac runways. You had a large field in effect, the size of probably 10 or so football fields on which the aircraft landed. the only concrete there was for parking and for the terminal buildings and hangars. And if you see at the bottom of the screen here, you can see a row of hangars at the bottom of the screen. That is these buildings here. And if we zoom in, today, now as part of an industrial estate in London, there is one of the hangars from the old Heston Aerodrome still here. It was one of the first concrete buildings built in the UK. It was grade 2 listed back in 2009. It's now part of a parcel dispatching company's storage facilities. But it's still there. It represents the fact that once upon a time, this was Heston Aerodrome, a major part of London's transport links. And it was at Heston Aerodrome in September 1938 that this occurred. You may have remembered this from your history. This was Neville Chamberlain arriving back from Munich as part of the Munich crisis. The Nazi German regime was invading the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and along back came Neville Chamberlain. This morning I had a talk with the German Chancellor. On this piece of paper bears his name, "There will be peace in our times." That location where that picture was taken is actually now the car park of the Asda warehouse in Heston. Now, remember I said that airports at the time were pretty small. The aerodrome at Heston was relatively small. Chamberlain arrived on a Lockheed 12 aircraft in September, on the 30th of September 1938. If you'd have looked across the field, now across the M4, you would have seen another aircraft. This aircraft, Golf Alpha Tango Lima, this is another Lockheed 12, very similar to the aircraft that Chamberlain arrived on. This was the Gulfstream of its time, the executive transport of the wealthy, very fast, able to fly at very high altitudes. It was, the executive jet of its time. This particular aircraft was owned by an Australian businessman by the name of Sidney Cotton. Sidney Cotton is a fantastic character. He was a pilot in the First World War with the Royal Naval Air Service. He ended up surveying quite a lot of Newfoundland in the Middle East during the middle years between the wars. He was a great inventor. He invented the Sidcot flying suit. If you want to describe him today, he would be the combination of a cross between, I suppose, Elon Musk and Piers Morgan. Now, you wouldn't guess it by looking at him, but he fell out with literally everybody he did business with. He went bust numerous times between the wars, but nevertheless made quite a lot of money on property investments and deals he did in the city. He was a wealthy man. One of the businesses he got involved with was a color production process called the Duret color process. And this basically took black and white film negatives and turned them into color negatives by using a system of three printing or three overprinting, using red, green, and blue dots. So not so dissimilar to the red, green, and blue dots that you're probably looking at your LED screen watching this presentation. So the same basic technology that we now use to watch, color images on our computer screens. He was partially responsible for managing and marketing in Europe during the 1930s. And he made a good business out of this, enough so that he could fly around Europe talking to potential customers in his Lockheed about this particular photographic process. Okay, so here he is, he's sitting there, his plane's sitting there at Heston Aerodrome. Later on, in the beginning of October in 1938, he was introduced over lunch to another gentleman by the name of Frederick Winterbottom. Frederick Winterbottom had an office in London in St. James's. He worked in the offices of the Miramax Fire Extinguisher Company. Here's St. James's tube station. You're probably familiar with that. If we walk along and down Broadway, we come to Broadway House. This is the location of the Miramax Fire Extinguisher Company. The Miramax Fire Extinguisher Company was a front. Frederick Winterbottom actually worked for the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6. He was a spy and was very closely associated with Churchill, who at that time wasn't in government, but was pushing the government to end its policy of appeasement. And he wanted Sidney Cotton to help him to start to gather intelligence about what was going on in Germany and what was going on in Italy in the Axis powers. Now, this was a black project. It wasn't in any way sanctioned by the government. The actual funding, where the money came for this process to happen, is still a bit lost in the mist of time. But he was able to supply Sidney Cotton with funding to install some of the latest aerial photography equipment in his Lockheed aircraft so that he could then go and capture aerial photography during his flights around Europe. He's been flying around Europe for the last 10 years or so. No one would really pay too much attention, so it was thought. The equipment he got was actually from a company based in Willesden, the Williamson Manufacturing Company. And this is an interesting point in geography. Today, the location of Williamson's factory is just another suburban residential street in London. And this is really interesting, I think. Actually, there's a hidden industrial history in London that's now largely invisible. There were many, many companies, organizations producing all sorts of different industrial products once upon a time in London. They've all now disappeared. If you look on this image, you can see this row of terraced houses here at the top of the screen, or I guess in the middle of the screen. If I pull up the picture of their factory, that's that same row of terraced houses there that you saw in the image. And this is where the Williamson aircraft camera company were built, established. And I'm just going to show you a quick video of their camera system. It used a 5x5 inch negative. So imagine holding two iPhones together side by side. That's about the size of the negative. So quite a large negative. And it was remotely operated by a switch that was in the cockpit of the aircraft. You press the button to start images being taken. Images would be taken automatically every few seconds, and the film would be rolled on automatically as you went along, capturing the images. We'll move on from that. Okay, so with the money that the Special Secret Intelligence Service had provided, Cotton went off, fitted the cameras into his aircraft. In a hidden panel behind the cockpit, he put the switch to operate the cameras beside the pilot's seat, so it wasn't at all visible that that's what he was doing. And then off he went. One of the first trips he did was to fly down through the Mediterranean towards the beginning, spring of 1939, all the way down to Ethiopia, where the Italians had been occupying the country, visiting various naval bases on the way, capturing these images, taking along his mistress at the time as cover. They were seen to be, these jet setters of the time, flying around, enjoying themselves, but actually they were capturing this aerial photography on behalf of I guess, what we now call MI6. One of the customers from this imagery was a Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, i.e. the author of the James Bond series. He was the customer for the images that were being captured as part of this process. Well, this is all very exciting, all very James Bond, but where does it fit in with the industry as it is today? We've seen that, the color process that was used, that Dufray color process, is not so dissimilar to the way that we capture color imagery today, filtering light using red, green, and blue. There are some other key changes that came along with the development, and particularly what Sidney Cotton was doing in this 12-month period just before the beginning of the Second World War in 1939. One of the areas that he was asked and tasked to capture was the Westwall, or the Siegfried Line. This was an area of static defences between Germany and France. You can still visit parts of these defences today. They're very visible in the concrete posts in the ground. Initially, the task to capture these images of these defences was on behalf of the French Secret Service, the Deuxième Bureau, who are the equivalent, I guess, of SIS for the French. And they asked Sidney Cotton to carry out an imagery data capturing task around Mannheim to capture imagery for some particular sites he was interested in. And off he went, and he did this, flying at an altitude of about sort of 10,000 feet with a Deuxième Bureau agent sitting in the co-pilot seat saying, go here, go there. We want a picture of this area, we want a picture of that area. When they got back, the results were very, very disappointing. It didn't get the imagery they really wanted. There were issues with the quality of the aircraft itself. Obviously, you know, it didn't have a stabilized camera as we had today. They were problematic, not very happy. So Cotton decided to do things slightly differently. He went back and spoke with the Williamson aerial photography company and got their latest model camera, the F-24, and had them fitted on his Lockheed aircraft in a fixed location, pointing straight down, but also pointing slightly oblique, left and right, so that the aircraft now has three cameras, you know, pointing down and then pointing in slightly different directions. So that as he flew along capturing imagery, he was capturing what he could see directly vertically, but also with a little bit of overlap and oblique imagery on either side. This is exactly the same principle that now companies like Google and Apple use to capture the 3D imagery that we see in the city centers in things like Google Earth and Apple Maps. It was a real insight to say, well, let's use multiple cameras on the aircraft capturing imagery at the same time. That gives us, you know, redundancy, but it also gives us an element of overlap where we have images of the same location captured from slightly different perspectives. The other introduction of, I guess, a new process that Cotton established was to say, well, rather than buzzing around all over the place, let's do this much more systematically. And rather than a kind of a crazy route pattern, he decided that he would fly up and down across the border area in this much more systematic process. In many ways, it was a lot more scary for Cotton. He was intercepted on numerous occasions by Luftwaffe fighter aircraft, wondering what he was doing flying over the border area when he was meant to be, you know, a businessman going off on various trips. But it allowed him to capture imagery in a much more systematic fashion. And it also allowed him and the photo interpreters to look at the imagery in a very different fashion. Rather than capturing imagery for a particular target at a particular point in time, this allowed you to capture imagery on a regular basis, and then allow you to see changes across those different groups of images. And that's really what we're interested in today in terms of imagery, is where change happens, not necessarily capturing the imagery initially itself. The other final innovation that Cotton introduced in these last periods of the 1930s was in terms of the actual information gathered from aerial photographs. So now I'll take you to Wembley. And again, I want you to just take note of this building here, this sort of mock Tudor building here on the corner of the street. And you can see there's this empty space on the other side of the road. That was the location of a company called the Aircraft Operating Company, who were the British distributors of Wilt aerial photography equipment. Wilt built analytical plotters. They were a Swiss company, and as you would imagine, very much driven by precision. And a Wilt plotter is an analytical plotter. It allows you to put stereo aerial photographs into a large machine. I've got a picture of one here. Here we go. And use that machine then to actually make very precise measurements from the aerial photographs that you have. And Cotton was able to purchase a couple of Wilt A5 analytical plotters and to start to use those to actually make measurements from the aerial photographs that he was gathering. And this was a radical change. It suddenly turned aerial photography from being something that was, to be honest, the realm of cowboys into a real science. At the beginning of the Second World War, in September 1939, the Royal Air Force only had 7 aerial photograph interpreters. None of them had access to this sort of equipment. And the big change that Cotton and his approach brought was to turn the process of gathering this imagery into an industrial process. It turned it into a factory. RAF Medmenham, which is a country house near Henley in Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, was in importance probably in many ways equivalent to Bletchley Park. It had thousands of aerial photographers employed there during the Second World War, and much of the intelligence that was gathered from the Second World War came from the interpreters at RAF Medmenham. So it's a story that's, perhaps now a lot less known than the story of Bletchley Park, but equally important. So it's an amazing story to tell. We have a few odd locations you would never imagine are historically important today, largely because, much of the industrial history of London in particular has been lost through residential development, through other developments. You don't know that these places exist. But in that very specific period of time, from September 1938 to September 1939, the likes of Sidney Cotton created the aerial photography industry that we know so well today. And it was amazing it happened so quickly with just a couple of people involved. And it was something that moved from the private sector very, very rapidly to the public sector. Thank you very much.
Very nice, sir. Very nice.